It sure is awfully January in here. Ice falling from the sky, temperature changes below freezing every day, work days that start and end in darkness. Truly, this calls for something thematically appropriate. So let's talk about fae creatures who live in the desert and spend all day drinking cocktails. If not for my own environmental escapism, today we are diving into the Ashira, a cousin of the dryad and a really interesting spin on an iconic monster with a darkness just beneath the surface that isn't immediately apparent. Kind of like Transformers, but a plant. And they drink blood or whatever. So grab yourself a coconut and an appropriate drink to slurp out of it with a straw. Personally, I prefer tomato juice, and let's get into it. Dryads, as mysterious tree spirits, trace their lineage back to the myths of ancient Greece, though the concept of a magical creature living in a tree is hardly unique to Greek mythology. Across all manner of stories, whether pure fiction, religious, or on the border of the two in the realm of myth, there have been all sorts of depictions of beings that could be described as dryads or dryad adjacent. And as is often the case when it comes to D&D, the dryads we know and love are a sort of amalgamation of a few myths, primarily inspired by one of the most popular Greek depictions of a dryad, the Hamadryad. The results, of course, being a fae creature that lives in and has their life force tied to a singular tree. Dryads are generally non-violent, but they will absolutely not hesitate to turn you into mulch if you trespass on their territory with intent to cause harm to either them or their woodland home. However, a lot of times they don't really need to resort to violence. They'll simply use charms and enchantment magic to convince would-be trespassers to leave.
I try to start things off on the right foot, and you wouldn't do that, would you? So I'm gonna pay you $100 to fuck off.
And in the event that those charms should be unsuccessful, or you've already unknowingly or not committed a sin against the dryad, you may incur their wrath. Ashira, on the other hand, while still a type of dryad, have a much different MO when it comes to the way they live their lives. The one and only appearance across D&D's publication history for the Ashira was the Qadim Monstrous Compendium Appendix for 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons. I've talked about these appendices a few times in the past, but essentially it's just a monster manual that compiled a bunch of monsters from various sources, as well as a few entries into a themed tome of relevant creatures. And this one is all about the stuff from Qadim, which was the Arabian Nights themed setting, and as you can imagine, featured a ton of desert-centric monsters. Now I'm sure some of you are thinking, a dryad in the desert seems nonsensical. But stick with me for a minute. While there aren't exactly sprawling woodlands in the dehydrated lands the Ashira live in, there are still some trees. Date and coconut palms, as well as banana, lemon, plum, fig, and pomegranate trees are all potential homes for an Ashiran spirit. They're described as having long, thin limbs, wild hair, and in the most relatable descriptor I've ever read in a monster entry, incapable of sitting still. Much like the dryads from the monster manual, they do reside within trees and need them to survive. However, rather than being bound to a single tree, Ashira are more communal, enjoying a life lived and bound to an entire grove or orchard of trees, along with other members of their kind. Also, unlike dryads, Ashira not only love and truly enjoy the company of other creatures, mortals alike, they rely on it. See, in the desert, it's real hard to consistently collect enough water to feed an entire orchard of date trees, for example. So these fae spirits most commonly live in groves of domesticated trees. And that's really interesting and kind of flies in the face of everything we know about most fae creatures, but specifically dryads. They are extremely friendly and often while away their days by singing, dancing, and making conversation with other creatures who tend to their grove, all of which the Ashira consider to be good friends. In fact, they're so friendly that if someone does try to intrude on their grove, they will only resort to violence as an absolute last resort. And even then, they are known to nurse creatures back to health after defeating them in combat and then releasing them a few miles away from the grove. On the day-to-day though, Ashira are just straight up friendly guys. They're very personable, and they like talking to people. They make all their important choices by using good old-fashioned democracy, wherein the Ashira all make their arguments and vote to decide on a course of action if a decision has to be made about something important which is going to affect everybody. In fact, these creatures are so dependent on social interaction with others that they can literally become sick if they are forced to be alone for too long. But that's ultimately the driving force behind what an Ashira even is, which is the rare instance of a creature whose primary goal is to see everyone just being happy and getting along fine. Which on the surface might seem like all sunshine and rainbows, but I'll remind you, first off, this is a second edition monster. Secondly, that can create a lot of problems in and of itself. And I mean, there's also the blood sacrifices, but we'll get to that. But before we do, I gotta give a massive shout out to this week's video sponsor, Humblewood Tales, brought to us by Hit Point Press. Humblewood Tales is a new adventure supplement book for 5th edition that takes place in the lush world of Humblewood. Featuring expanded lore from the mystical tree city of Alderheart, Humblewood Tales is packed with over 200 pages of new adventures, pre-made characters, bestiary, magic items, shops and wares, the official guide to Alderheart, and much more for both new and seasoned Humblewood adventurers. Gather your party and embark on the new Humblewood adventures for level 3 through 8, where you'll encounter pirate mercenaries, face off against a slime king, take on a god of shadow in a nightmarish dreamscape, and more. What tales will you tell? Check out Humblewood Tales today for yourself by visiting the link right down in the description. Thank you so much once again to Hit Point Press for sponsoring this video. They've been a long-time supporter of this channel and I appreciate it a lot. So go ahead and show them some love and then tell them I sent you. Now, back to our desert tree pals. One of the most important ways Ashira differentiate themselves from standard dryads is in their mechanics. They've got that magic resistance and can do a lot of the same things, such as speaking with plants and animals or charming other creatures with their fey magic. However, Ashira are a little bit faster and they hit a little bit harder. They're also capable of restraining their enemies by using sticky sap, which is a ranged attack they have access to, and that can be very useful for preventing would-be trespassers from advancing on their grove. They've also got Tree Stride as a bonus action, meaning they can move quite easily through their grove, disappearing and reappearing wherever they please. In the Ashira's case, this is most commonly used in a playful way, but it can also be used very effectively in combat. Their spell list is fairly similar to the Dryad, however instead of Goodberry, Ashira can cast Cure Wounds, and they can also cast Entangle, which is fun. I also swapped out their ability to speak Elvish with the ability to speak Primordial, because at least as far as I'm concerned, they are much more connected with the arid and rugged landscape of a desert, rather than kind of the woodland, fey, elvish, sylvan thing going on in the forest. However, that's pretty much all this creature has going for it. It's a fun little low CR stat block that does what a Dryad should and would do, except it's a little different, and they live in the desert. They do have a few fun combat tricks up their sleeve, but this is obviously a creature much more geared towards social encounters. So let's talk about blood sacrifice. Oh, you didn't think I was gonna just leave you hanging on that, did you? See, in the sourcebook, there's this one little paragraph of text that I found very interesting. Ashira abhor all forms of violence and always flee from combat unless their home trees are threatened. In defense of their orchard, they can grow fierce, even bloodthirsty. Some claim that the Ashira once demanded yearly blood sacrifices to nourish their bountiful trees, but their present peaceful nature seems to belie this tale. This version of the Ashira paints them in a much more sinister light, and while the book doesn't go way down the rabbit hole of what that could mean, I found that very compelling. So I had an idea. What if there was a more powerful Ashira? A version of this creature who didn't rely on other creatures to look after it or ensure its grove stayed watered. Instead, they could simply take the water they need from the blood of their victims, and in so doing, become stronger and more powerful. So this is where our second stat block comes in this week, which is another version of the Ashira entirely created by me based on this paragraph of text called the Ashira Blood Quench. This guy is CR6, so a bit more powerful than the standard Ashira, and has a few new powers. For one, they have more strength and constitution on account of all that sweet, sweet life juice they slurp up. Their claw attack also now deals necrotic damage and heals them for half the necrotic damage they deal, sort of like the vampiric touch spell, but just built into their strikes. And I gave them a once per day casting of Blight, which is fun for me. They still have that sticky sap ability, but suddenly it seems a lot less defensive and a lot more I'm gonna hold you in place while I desiccate your body, which is a pure horror show. I also gave them an ability inspired by horrid wilting called Quench Thirst. This once per day action allows the Ashira to deal 12d8 necrotic damage, or half as much on a constitution save, to any number of living creatures within 60 feet of it. It does not affect undead or constructs, but it does kill anyone dropped to 0 hit points as, you know, all the blood from their body is siphoned away and they dry up like a mummy in The Mummy. Which I think is pretty metal, but it does not end there. For each target slain by this ability, the Ashira can cast Awaken on a mundane tree of its choice within 120 feet, as it literally siphons the life energy away from a target and puts it into a tree within the grove. This is really brutal. but it also sets up so many iconic villainous dryad activities. Maybe the Ashira has attendants, just simple commoners with a few hit points in its grove. It might not even target the party with this ability, but rather use it to transform those mere commoners into awakened trees who are much more capable defenders. This also means the trees, who are now moving around and taking actions, can function as mobile teleportation points for the Ashira, who can use Tree Stride as a bonus action. And that is very cool. But whether you choose to opt for the friendly dancing and singing Ashira, or the bloodthirsty Ashira of the ancient past, or maybe a mixture of the two, there are so many interesting stories you can tell using this creature, and that is why I ultimately decided to do a video about it. So let's talk about that. If you want to disregard much of the lore that makes Ashira unique and simply use them as a more thematic stand-in for an encounter you might run with a dryad, they certainly can function as just a dryad, but in the desert, if that's what you want. However, I do think this creature, like all creatures, really shines when you lean into the lore that makes them especially unique and interesting. An encounter with a group of friendly fae spirits is likely not something your players are going to expect when sneaking through a monarch's palace in the desert. If you're doing something that involves lots of political intrigue, perhaps the Ashira can serve as a source of information even. We all know that the juiciest gossip and politically motivated conversation happens in the palace gardens after all, and you never know when one of the trees might be listening. Or perhaps the players are in the middle of robbing the place, only for a curious Ashira to slide up behind them and ask what they're up to. But in any case, I think it's really important to establish what the Ashira's relationship is with its caretaker in any kind of situation like this. Do they love and care for the palace attendants, or do they wish that they were someone else? Or perhaps the palace has fallen into ruin and the Ashira survive in the remains of a once great empire, awaiting the return of life to the region and just barely scrape by. Such creatures would be overjoyed to see the players rolling on into the ruins of this palace. If they haven't seen anyone for years, they're gonna be so happy, if not a little bit mad, as long as they haven't gone totally crazy or, you know, maybe decide to harvest the players for their life-giving juices. Another thing about the Ashira I find both funny and also just fun is the fact that they will restore intruders back to health before releasing them away from the grove. So maybe you have a small grove of Ashira on the border of two countries that are at war, and once in a while hungry soldiers from both sides wander into the grove looking to fill their bellies, threatening to desecrate the trees in the process. The Ashira would surely defend their home, likely tending to the soldiers' wounds after the fact and then dumping them a few miles away. But what if some of the soldiers, now disenchanted by warfare, decided to stay? The players could be hired to look into a possible monster or enemy presence within an area that some soldiers have gone missing, only to find the missing soldiers living peacefully in the Ashiran Grove. Do they rat out these soldiers to their superiors back home, keep their secrets, or a secret third thing? Maybe the commander from one side of the conflict discovers the grove and marches some other soldiers over with intent to burn it down. Would the players help defend such a place, or simply watch it turn to ashes? And I mean, if nothing else, these guys can make for great random encounters in the middle of the desert. The players may stumble upon an oasis where a group of Ashira live peacefully, offering them respite on their journey across the desert. Or maybe the magic that keeps the oasis so full of life is fueled by the life force of living creatures the Ashira blood quenches drain, adding a villainous bend to this apparent paradise. And if you don't want the Ashira to be the main focus of your campaign or the place where they show up or the encounter even, they would make fantastic companion characters to any type of druid in the desert. In the case of a druid antagonist, the Blood Quench stat block can provide a pungent threat to any combat they partake in, especially if there are other trees around. But no matter how you choose to use this creature, I think the Ashira provides a very valuable addition to any dungeon master's menagerie of creatures, and I hope that they prove to be useful to you at some point in the future. If you do want to use the Ashira, as always, linked in the description down below is a Google document with all of the stats for this monster. And if you are one of my lovely patrons over on the Dungeon Dad Patreon, also linked in the description down below, you will find the PDF stat block, which is all the same information, but with the new artwork done by Dakota Curry this week. They look fantastic, very happy Ashira indeed, as well as just some nicer layout and that kind of thing, so you can either print it out, stick it in your DM folder, or simply have it for you to look at on your computer. It's only a few bucks a month, and it not only gives you access to the Ashira, it gives you access to all of the monsters I have made, which is like, I don't know how many we're on at this point, but I've been doing this for like, what, 8 years? So there's a few of them in there. Speaking of Patreon, I want to give a massive shout out to this week's randomly selected patron of the week. Thank you so much this week to Chad Fell. I hope it didn't hurt too much. I'm sure this is a joke you've never heard before. And thank you for watching. As always, if there's a monster from a previous edition of D&D, Pathfinder, another tabletop game, or I don't know, a video game, anything, any type of monster out there that you would like to see get updated 5th edition stats and hear me talk about for 10 to 40 minutes, let me know in the comments down below or in the Monster Suggestions channel on the Dungeon Dad Discord, which is also linked in the description down below. And who knows, you might just see it show up in a future episode of Monster of the Week. But that's all I got for you today. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Until then.